Hello everyone, I'm Jason Toms. I'm currently a senior in high school and I love science and I love sharing it. So this is the first video that I'm making and I plan on making much more videos covering all the sciences. But yeah, let's just start on today's video, which is biological macromolecules. Specifically, we're going to be doing their classification, composition, and a couple examples. So biological macromolecules fit into four categories. These are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So I made this table to kind of show how carbohydrates are organized, which is carbohydrates are classified as simple or complex and are either monosaccharides, disaccharides, or polysaccharides. So as you can see, monosaccharides and disaccharides are both simple carbohydrates, while polysaccharides are complex. A little bit more about their classification. Monosaccharides are made of one simple sugar structure and are the simplest kind. Disaccharides are made of two monosaccharides, which are formed through dehydration synthesis, which is a reaction where monomers are joined together and H2O is created, but we won't go into what that looks like chemically in this video at least. And then polysaccharides are made of three or more simple sugars, which can form long chains. Carbohydrates are composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they usually come in a 1-to-1 molecular ratio of carbon to water, which looks like this. Example being glucose, which is C6H12O6, which is the sugar used to store energy created by plants in photosynthesis. Now this isn't a rule, but generally they will come with this ratio. Simple carbohydrates form a carbon backbone that arranges itself in a ring, which we'll see a little bit later, examples of these. And the simple carbohydrates then form chains that can be either straight or branched, which are polysaccharides. We'll see a couple examples of these later on. Right here. So, as you can see, they form rings where each vertex is going to be a carbon molecule. That's the glucose example that we used before. That's a monosaccharide. Here's sucrose, which is an example of a disaccharide. As you can see, it's two monosaccharides joined together. And then this is a polysaccharide where each of these individual shapes is one of these monosaccharides. So let's move on to lipids and their classification. There are many kinds of lipids with vastly different functions, and lipids are considered hydrophobic, which means they repel water. And they're hydrophobic because they're nonpolar, which means they do not have regions with differing charges, whereas something like water is polar, meaning it has both negative and positive regions. And so because of the differences between water and lipids, being that they are both polar and nonpolar, they kind of repel each other. So moving on, lipids have two different kinds of monomers, which are fatty acids and glycerol. And they don't have true polymers, but they do make up larger units. Examples are triglycerides, phospholipids, and steroids. And chemically, they are composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they can also contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. One example of a lipid that contains all these elements is a phospholipid, which is very important in creating our cell membrane. But let's just look at what a fatty acid looks like right now. And there's two different kinds of fatty acids. There's saturated and unsaturated. What saturated means is that it has more hydrogen atoms. And the reason for this is because as you look at the unsaturated one, there's a double bond right here, which will result in less hydrogen overall. And this double bond also creates this kink that you see here. So let's look at the phospholipid. The phospholipid is comprised of a phosphate group and a fatty acid group here. And the phosphate group is polar, and the fatty acids are nonpolar. So this will orient itself towards an aqueous solution, while this will orient itself away from the aqueous solution. And this is important in the structure of our cell membrane, which I might do a video on, but you don't have to worry about what that looks like right now. So nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are composed of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus. And these are the components that comprise DNA and RNA. And their purpose is to store information and provide structure to DNA and RNA. They're made up of a sugar, which is either ribose or deoxyribose. They are made of a phosphate group and a nitrogen base, which is cytosine, guanine, adenine, thymine, or uracil. And which sugar it is, either ribose or deoxyribose, and which nitrogenous bases it includes depend on whether it is DNA or RNA. So this is an example. This is DNA. Here is the sugar, which would be deoxyribose in this case because it's DNA. Here's the phosphate group, and these are the nitrogenous bases containing guanine, cytosine, thymine, and adenine because this is a DNA example. So lastly, proteins. Proteins are comprised of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. Proteins perform functions in the body including structure, digestion, signaling, and so many other things. Proteins, they really do it all. They're super important for every process, really. They have 4 levels of structure. The first level, which is the primary structure, describes the sequence of amino acids. And these are amino acids here, each individual circle here. And the secondary structure is the folding of amino acids because of hydrogen bonds. And they can form either alpha helices or beta sheets. So you'll see here, this is the alpha helix, and this is the beta sheet. So the tertiary structure, which is the third level of structure of a protein, is a 3-dimensional shape as a result of hydrophobic and hydrophilic regions. So what that means is it'll fold. Some regions will fold away from an aqueous solution, and some regions will fold towards it, and this gives it its functional shape. Finally, the quaternary structure of a protein is the arrangement of separate amino acid chains called subunits that form a functional protein. And this is the example hemoglobin, which we'll look at on the next slide. So you'll see in the center, O2 will bind to the center of the protein, and this will cause a conformational change, meaning the shape of the protein will change, and it will allow more O2 to bind. And this hemoglobin is what carries O2 through our bloodstream. So I made a table here to kind of keep track of what we've gone over generally. So carbohydrates are comprised of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Their monomers are monosaccharides, their polymers are polysaccharides, and their function is mainly to store energy. Lipids are comprised of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Their monomers are fatty acids and glycerol. They do not have true polymers, and their function is cell membrane, communication, and store energy. Nucleic acids are comprised of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And their monomers are sugar, phosphate, nitrogen base, and their polymers are DNA and RNA, and their function is to store genetic information. Proteins are comprised of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Their monomers are amino acids, and their polymers are a polypeptide, which is the chain of amino acids. And their function, well, they have so many functions. So let's do some questions. The first question is, which of these statements is true? A, lipids function only to store energy for cellular use. B, both lipids and nucleic acids can be synthesized containing a phosphate group. C, proteins contain the elements carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. And D, carbohydrates do not have true polymers. So I'll just give a second to pause, look at it, answer it. So the answer is B, and the reason for that is if we go 2 slides back, you'll see that the only 2 elements, or the only 2 macromolecules that contain the element phosphorus are lipids and nucleic acids. So that lines up with option B, where both lipids and nucleic acids can be synthesized containing a phosphate group. The next question is, ducks have specialized glands that produce a liquid they coat their feathers with. This liquid keeps their feathers from getting wet, allowing them to swim without being waterlogged. What kind of macromolecule is this liquid most likely comprised of? So I'll give you a second to answer it. The answer is lipids, and this is because they are hydrophobic, meaning they repel water. So yeah, you just kind of have to know that this property about lipids, that they will repel water. This is how you kind of come up with this answer. So thank you for watching my presentation on biological macromolecules. And if you have any suggestions or requests on what topics you want me to do next across any science, really, leave them in the comments. And I'll really be happy to do it. But thank you.